Hey guys, Enith here. Just as a forewarning, there's a cat on this table with me, so if she decides to make any weird noises or otherwise walk in front of the camera, you'll know why. So, in the last video, I talked about how to pick a story concept, how to find the interesting part about the world that you built, and put it together in a way that it could become a story. But a story concept isn't the only thing that you need when it comes to actually building a story. You also need to figure out how you're going to tell that story and what that story is actually going to be. What story beats do you hit? What characters do you follow? What's your plot? The stuff that we usually call a story. So there's a lot of different types of story that you can try to tell. Some of the more common ones, especially for things like young adult novels or just in general media, are the adventure story, the quest, or the redemption, right? And those are all pretty normal and pretty self-explanatory as well. Hello, Shadow. With me not really, I don't really want to spend too much time explaining those right now, and that will become apparent why. But no matter what type of story you pick to tell, you're going to have to figure out how it is that you're going to give your reader the information that they need to follow that story. This is an important topic because I tried to make a video talking about these types of story, and I found myself having to explain how to get across information first, and it made the video really long. So instead, I'm going to sort of split it into two things and have this be sort of a three-part series on how to pick a story as opposed to a two-parter. So for this bit, I'm going to talk about some of the ways in which you can present information to your reader or to the person who is consuming your media, whatever media it is that you're making, whether it's a game or a book or whatever, anything with a story. Now, this sounds a little bit boring at first, admittedly, but it's very important because how it is that you choose to present information defines what type of story that you're going to be able to write. Generally, I like to split the presentation of information into one of two different types. There's subtypes, and there's other ways that you can go about it, but these are the two sort of more well-known ones and kind of the ones that matter more for the purpose of this discussion. So the first method of presenting information is relatively straightforward, and it is very common. It's when you just tell the reader things. When you have a narrator that just states facts, or a character that states facts or something like that to the person who is reading or interacting with your story, and those facts and those statements can be taken at face value. Note that I'm not talking about show versus tell here. That's a discussion for a different time. I'm just talking about the information itself. When you present information in this way through a sort of reliable narrator, so to speak, it's good information. Your readers can just take it at face value and accept it as true. This is, like I said, the most common and generally the simplest method of information, of presenting information to the reader. The second method is more complicated and more difficult to execute. It involves telling the reader pieces of information and not filling things out entirely. The idea here is that you leave a bunch of stuff out, and your reader, through the information that you've given them, weaves together their own filler into those gaps. The idea here is to leave the underlying structure of your narrative a little bit less clear. This requires the person who's reading your story or engaging with it to actively think about the elements that you've given them and put them together kind of like a puzzle. This allows for a lot of really cool things. It lets you have speculation on the parts of the reader. It lets you put in some mystery in elements that you'd like to have remain mysterious. It generates a lot of interest in some cases. However, in my experience, this is not easy to pull off. It's very, very rarely done for an entire piece of media. So generally speaking, this is not something that you will do by itself. And when you do see it done, it's usually done improperly. It's not executed in a way that makes it interesting. So like I said, there are other methods, but these are the two that we're going to focus on for the time being. Since the first method I talked about, the more straightforward one, is so common, I'm not going to spend too much time explaining what it is and how to do it. Most of the writing and media that you consume falls into this category. When you want your reader to know something, you either show them or you tell them. It's really, really, really straightforward. The advantage to this method is that it's very, very easy to execute. It's intuitive. You don't need to think about it. You just put it down onto paper. And it's also very, very easy for your reader to follow. They can take that information and just parse it very easily. They don't have to do very much legwork to understand the details of the story or what's going on. It's right there in front of them. The disadvantage to this method, however, is that if you're not careful, the writing can get very, very stale and predictable. If you give them too much information, if you tell them too much here, if they know too much of what's going on, it's very easy for a reader to put these things together and know the ending to your story before you want them to. So it's a little bit of a double-edged sword when you're this obvious or this straightforward with your information. To explain the second method of providing information, it's a lot easier to talk about pieces of media that have done it properly, or improperly even, just a piece of media that has done it. And one of the best examples of this being done right is actually not a book or a movie or anything like that, although there are very good examples there as well. But one of the best examples that I found of it being done properly is the Dark Souls franchise from FromSoft, a video game franchise. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Dark Souls, it is a game that takes place in a medieval fantasy setting, and the premise is that in each of the three games, your character, which is different and has a different origin in each of the three games, as they take place in different time periods, has to do something called linking the fire. The exact consequences or purpose of linking the fire is mostly left vague. There are some pretty strong hints as to what it'll do and what it won't do, and some consequences that are going to be that are discussed throughout the games, but it's nothing, or very, very little is explicitly stated. The majority of the information in the Dark Souls universe is told by illusion. It's told by illuminating things around what the storyteller wants you to see. So what they do, for example, is they tell stories through small, incomplete descriptions. And these descriptions are almost always interrelated, whether they're the descriptions of an item or a location or a group of people, something like that. And they're interrelated, like I said, and however they're spread out so that you don't get all of that information at once. In order to get a full picture, you need to take these descriptions and put them together like a puzzle, like I said. Now, the difference is that whereas in the first method you would have a complete puzzle at the end, in something like Dark Souls, in a series or a work using the second method, you would not have the complete puzzle. You would end up with outlines of things. It's like being in a dark room. You'd see outlines of shapes, but the shapes themselves are not necessarily clear. And only by thinking about what those outlines imply can your reader get any real information out of the setting. Of course, it's up to you how much information that you provide them, how much illumination, so to speak, that you give them, but for the most part, that's the difference between the two. The advantage of this second method is that, again, it forces the person who's engaging with your media to think about the information that they already have. It gives you a lot of flexibility with when and how information is presented because it doesn't have to be done all at once. And new information can feel like a reward of sorts. which leads someone who's reading through or engaging to want to continue to find out more about the setting. This is very, very important when it comes to things like mysteries, as if you do this right, it can create mysteries by itself without you really having to think about it too much. When you don't reveal the whole picture, people will naturally try to fill that picture in. And if you give them good information, if you give them right information, and if you execute it properly, they'll end up pretty close to what you want them to. So, despite the large advantages of this second method, however, the disadvantages are very, very significant. For one, this requires way more preparation on the part of the author. You need to know not just what it is that you are telling the reader, but you need to know what you aren't telling them. If you're giving the reader outlines for things, you have to know what everything is. The reason for that is the things that you're saying have to be consistent with each other. They have to be internally consistent, which is very, very hard when you're not sharing the whole picture. It's also difficult to properly balance the amount of information that you're giving and withholding. If you provide too much information while you're doing this, it just ends up being more tedious than interesting. And if you provide too little, it's easy for the reader to get frustrated with the lack of understanding of what's going on. There's also another point, which is some people just don't like it when their stories are presented this way. They prefer something easier to understand or easier to follow. With this said, though, you can mix both methods to give yourself a little bit of breathing room. You can use the second method when you're talking about things that you want to remain in clear to either the characters or the readers, or both, perhaps. And this can be everything from the origin of an important item or artifact to the existence of a hidden group, the history of the events in the world, even the world itself, perhaps, things like this. And what you do then is you use the first method for the majority of the information that you provide. That being things that the characters would know that you want the reader to know as well. This provides something of a bridge between the pieces of information that you're hiding and the pieces of information that you are giving out. So the reason that this is important when considering what kind of story arc that you want to tell is that depending on which one of those you do want to tell, you're going to want to obscure different things. If you're telling an adventure, obscuring the destination or the purpose of the adventure might be more interesting. Whereas with a quest, you kind of have to know what the end game is, at least a little bit, for there to be any real engagement in the story, right? So different story archetypes, different story arcs, they require a different amount of the first and the second method of information, of providing information. And that means that if you don't like one of those two, you're going to want to pick a story type that fits what it is that you want to write. So basically, the reason that I'm giving you... Oh, hello. Yes. Shadow is sniffing my keyboard. I don't think you can see this, but she's just right. Okay. Hello, Shadow. Yes. Here, I'm just gonna have her say hello to everybody. Yes, hello. Oh, hello, baby. She wants to leave, so I will let her leave. Anyway, where was I? Sorry. So the purpose here of talking about this is that you need to be able to think about what it is that you want to do with these two methods. If you're more comfortable with one than the other, you're going to want to focus on a story that plays to that advantage, or alternatively, one that lets you practice doing one of them specifically. There's a couple more points about this mixed method that I want to go into before closing out the video, however, which is that you need to keep in mind that when using this mixed method, it is important to have a way to know what it is that you've said. This is also important if you're just using the second method, but with the mixed method especially because you're giving out more information. You can have a notebook or a Word document or something like that that just helps you take notes on what it is that you've already told the reader, and a separate one or a separate page or something that includes what you haven't. So you have sort of your outline notebook with information that you've given, and your filling in notebook with information that you haven't. And this is going to help you stay on track with what it is that you want to say. If you have another very common problem, I know I have when I've tried to do this, it's common for you to have trouble intuiting what it is that your readers will understand about the information that you give them. We can't really put ourselves in other people's shoes in that way as the person writing the story because we know the whole story. So it's harder for us to see whether or not we're actually giving what we need to give. The easiest way around that is to find a friend or an acquaintance or something like that and give them the notes of what you have told them, of what you've told the readers, and have them read through and tell you what it is that they think is going on. Then you can gauge a little bit better whether you've given too much information, too little information, what you need to highlight a bit more, what you need to pull out a little bit more. And that can be very, very helpful. You do have to keep in mind, though, that if you're doing this, you either want to do it with a few different people or you want to take it with a grain of salt. Different people are better or worse at picking up on the hints and the connections that you're trying to drop, so you'll need to give yourself a little bit of leeway in that regard. But now that we've had this conversation, we can actually figure out what story it is that we want to tell. Like I said before, because these different story types use different amounts of ways that you provide information, we need to know what those were before we can have that conversation. But now we're informed enough to do that. So the next video is going to focus on how to pick a type of story to tell and how to frame that story in the world that we've already built. Have a nice one, guys. I'll talk to you next time. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy my content, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and click on the little bell so you know when I release a new video. Leave a comment if you have any questions, and if you want to know more about my writing, there's a link to my websites in the description. Talk to you next time.